What if the fiercest storm of your life wasn't outside your door, but inside your heart, and the only way to survive was to open that door to a stranger? Would you risk the whispers of the town, your own fragile peace, and a decade of grief, just to save one soul? The wind was a living thing that night, a predator howling down from the northern peaks, clawing at the old farmhouse with talons of ice. It found every crack in the chinking, every loose board in the barn, and screamed its way inside. I'd lived with that sound for 10 winters alone, and most times it was just a noise. But tonight it sounded like a dirge for a world frozen solid. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, a relentless, silent siege that had buried the fence posts and transformed the familiar landscape into a vast, unforgiving sea of white. My name is Abel Mason. I'm 53, though the lines etched on my face by the sun and sorrow might tell you a different story. My hands are gnarled and calloused, shaped by the axe handle and the plow, but they hadn't held another's in warmth for a decade. 10 years since I buried Hannah and our boy, who never drew his first breath under the big cedar on the hill. The fever had taken them in a blizzard just like this one, and with them it had taken the color and warmth from my world, leaving me with nothing but shades of gray and the biting cold of memory. The farm was my penance and my sanctuary. The rhythm of the chores was the only thing that kept the silence in my head at bay. Chopping wood, hauling water, tending to my old mule, Old Ben. These were the rituals that marked the passing of days that otherwise bled one into the next. That evening, the ache in my bones was deeper than usual. I'd spent the afternoon clearing a path to the barn, the snow so deep it came past my knees, each shovelful a dead weight. Now with the chores done, I pulled on my heavy coat, lit the lantern, and stepped out for one last check. The air was so cold it felt like swallowing broken glass. The lantern light cut a weak golden circle in the swirling snow, the flakes dancing like frantic ghosts. Old Ben stamped his hoof in his stall as I approached, his warm breath pluming in the frigid air. I ran a hand along his neck, the familiar texture, a small comfort. As I turned to secure the main barn door, the lantern light swept across something that didn't belong. At first it was just a shape, a dark mound against the snow-dusted wall, barely distinguishable from the shadows. My first thought was a wolf driven down from the mountains by hunger, but it was too still. I took a step closer, my heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The light fell upon a tangle of black hair matted with ice, and the outline of a body curled into itself, a desperate attempt to conserve what little warmth it had left. It was a woman. My breath hitched. Danger. That was the first word that clawed its way through my mind. This was a hard land, and desperate people did desperate things. My rifle was back in the house. I stood frozen for a long moment, the wind tearing at me, listening. But there was no sound but the storm's fury and the frantic beating of my own heart. Slowly, cautiously, I moved closer, holding the lantern high. She was native, that much was clear from her high cheekbones and the dark, straight hair that fell across her face. Her clothes were little more than rags, a thin dress that offered no protection against the winter's bite, torn at the shoulder, and offering a glimpse of skin that looked unnervingly pale. Her feet were wrapped in what was left of some deerskin moccasins, soaked through and surely frozen. She was half buried in a snowdrift that had curled around the corner of the barn. I knelt, the snow crunching under my knees, and reached out a hesitant, gloved hand. I expected her skin to be as cold as ice, the stillness of death upon her. But when my fingers brushed her neck, searching for a pulse, I felt it. A faint, thready flutter, a stubborn little bird beating its wings against a cage of ice. She was alive. The weight of a decision heavier than any shovelful of snow settled on my shoulders. I could go back inside, lock the door, pretend I'd seen nothing. By morning, the snow would have covered her completely, and the wind would be the only witness. The folks in town of Solitude, in the unlikely event they ever found out, wouldn't blame me. An Apache woman alone in a storm, they'd spit the word like a curse and say she got what was coming to her. But as I looked at her so utterly defeated by the elements, I saw Hannah's face. In the final hours, her skin pale, her breathing shallow. I remembered the helplessness, the profound, soul-crushing loneliness of watching life slip away while the world outside went on indifferent. I remembered how not a single soul from town had braved the blizzard to help me dig the graves. They'd offered their condolences weeks later when the ground had thawed enough for them to travel, but their words were hollow things stripped of meaning by their absence when it mattered. I couldn't do it. I couldn't be one of them. I wouldn't leave another soul to face the end alone in the cold. "All right, Lord," I muttered to the screaming wind, the words torn from my lips. "I hear you. Setting the lantern down in a clear spot, I carefully began to brush the snow away from her. She was so light it was alarming. I slid my arms under her, one beneath her knees, the other supporting her back. Lifting her was like lifting a bundle of sticks in cold fabric. Her head lolled back and rested against my chest, and I felt a faint hot puff of her breath against my neck. It was the first touch of human warmth I'd felt in a decade, and it struck me with the force of a physical blow. I carried her into the barn. The air inside was still freezing, but at least it was free of the wind's relentless assault. Old Ben watched with wide, curious eyes as I laid her down on a thick, dry bed of straw in an empty stall, the same stall where I'd kept a milk cow before she'd gone dry and I'd sold her. I took off my own heavy coat and draped it over her, then hurried back to the house. My movements were clumsy, urgent. I stoked the fire in the hearth until it roared, then filled a pot with snow to melt for water. I found the old quilt Hannah had made, the one I kept folded in a chest at the foot of my bed, and grabbed a spare blanket. When I returned to the barn, she had stirred. Her eyes were open, just slits, but they were dark and sharp, and they held a fear so profound, it was almost a physical presence in the small space. She tried to push herself up, a small guttural sound escaping her lips. "Easy now," I said, my voice rough from disuse. I kept my distance, setting the blankets down near her, but not touching her again. "Easy. You're safe from the storm here." I wasn't sure if she understood my words, but she seemed to understand my tone, my lack of aggression. She watched me, every muscle in her body tensed, as I went to the water bucket, dipped a ladle in, and brought it to her. I knelt a few feet away and held it out. Her gaze flickered from my face to the ladle and back again. For a long time she did nothing. Then, with a movement so slow it was painful to watch, she reached out a trembling hand. Her fingers were raw and red. She took the ladle and drank, the sound of her swallowing loud in the relative quiet of the barn. She drank it all, then let the ladle fall from her fingers. I went back to the house and returned with a heel of bread and a piece of jerky. I set them on a clean rag beside her. She ignored the jerky, but her eyes fixed on the bread. She tore off a piece with shaking fingers and chewed it slowly, deliberately, as if reteaching her body how to accept food. I retreated to an overturned bucket near the barn door, keeping the lantern between us. I needed to be ready if she tried to run or if trouble came looking for her. I watched her as she ate. She was Apache, no doubt about it. Even beneath the grime and exhaustion, there was a strength in the line of her jaw, a fierce pride in her eyes that hardship hadn't managed to extinguish. She was beautiful in a wild, untamed way, like the land itself. I forced myself to push that thought away. It was a thought for a different man, a man who wasn't half dead himself. "What's your name?" I asked. Into the silence, my voice low. She looked up, her chewing paused, her lips parted, cracked and dry. "Alara," she whispered. The word was soft, but it landed in the quiet barn with the weight of a stone. "Abel," I replied, nodding once. We sat in silence for what felt like hours. She finished the bread. I kept watch. My mind, usually so quiet, was a whirlwind. She had nothing. No pack, no weapon, no extra clothing. Someone had run her out, likely from Solitude, 20 miles east. Chased her out into a death sentence of a storm. If I took her inside, my houseword would eventually get out. Abel Mason, the grieving recluse, was shacking up with an Apache. The scandal would be a feast for the town gossips. The condemnation from the more pious folk would be swift. My quiet, lonely life would be over. But if I left her here, she would die. It was as simple as that. The cold would finish the job that starvation and exhaustion had started. Alara, for her part, watched me back. I could feel her weighing me, judging me. She'd known a world of men who took without asking, whose kindness was a currency for something else. I saw the question in her eyes. What did I want from her? The truth was, I didn't know. I only knew that the sight of her so close to death had stirred something in the frozen depths of my soul. A flicker of responsibility. A ghost of the man I used to be, the man who had loved Hannah and had planned to build a family. Finally, the exhaustion of the day pulled at me. I dragged a few empty feed sacks near the door and laid them out. I wasn't about to sleep in my own warm bed while a woman, a stranger, lay on straw. It didn't feel right. "You get some rest," I said, my voice sounding more certain than I felt. "The storm's the only thing that'll bother you tonight." I stretched out on the rough burlap, the cold from the packed earth floor seeping into my bones. I kept the lantern burning low between us. Outside, the wind howled its mournful song. Inside, for the first time in 10 years, the barn was filled with the sound of two people breathing. And though we were both awake long into the night, strangers separated by culture and fear for a few hours in the heart of that blizzard, neither of us was truly alone. The first light of morning was a pale, grudging thing filtering through the cracks in the barn walls in thin gray spears. The world outside was still and silent, the wind having finally cried itself to sleep. A fresh blanket of snow at least another foot deep had fallen during the night, muffling all sound. I woke with a groan, every muscle in my back protesting its makeshift bed. My first thought, sharp and immediate, was of her. I pushed myself up on one elbow and looked toward the corner stall. Alara was awake. She was sitting up, my heavy coat clutched around her shoulders, her dark hair a wild curtain around her face. She was watching me, not with the raw terror of the night before, but with a quiet, unnerving intensity. Her eyes, even shadowed with exhaustion, missed nothing. I sat up slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves. I noticed she hadn't touched the jerky, I'd left only the bread. A small detail, but it told me something. Pride, or perhaps a custom I didn't understand. I filed the thought away. Morning, I grunted, my voice a low rumble. I pushed myself to my feet and stretched, trying to work the stiffness out of my spine. There's more water if you need it. I gestured with my head toward the bucket. She watched me for a moment longer, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. I crossed the space between us, my boots silent on the straw-covered floor, and refilled the ladle. This time I set it down within her reach, rather than handing it to her, giving her the choice to take it. She did, her fingers still trembling, but less so than the night before. As she drank, I took a better look at her in the daylight. Her skin was the color of rich earth, her features strong and defined, but her dress was in even worse shape than I'd realized. It was ripped in several places, and the fabric was so thin it was a miracle it hadn't disintegrated entirely. Bruises, dark and ugly, mottled the skin on her legs and arms. I understood then why she clutched the coat so tightly, a shield for her modesty and her pain. A wave of anger, cold and sharp, washed over me. I pictured the men who had done this, who had driven her out into the storm. I wondered if the sight of her, the vulnerability in her, stirred anything in me besides pity. A flicker of something primal, something I hadn't felt since Hannah, sparked and died in the cold emptiness of my chest. I stamped it out. She was a person in desperate need, not an object for a lonely man's forgotten desires. I would not become the men who had cast her out. You can stay here today, I said, my voice quiet but firm. Rest. The barn is warm enough and no one will bother you. Her dark eyes narrowed, searching my face. She understood me, at least partially. Why, she asked. Her voice was raspy, the single word a struggle. I scrubbed a hand over my graying beard, considering the question. How could I explain it? How could I put 10 years of grief and isolation, of watching a community fail to be a community, into a few simple words? Because leaving you out there to die would make me no better than the men who sent you away, said finally. It was the plain, unvarnished truth. She held my gaze for a long, heavy moment, then looked away. But I saw it. I saw the rigid line of her shoulders soften just a fraction. I spent the day going about my chores, always aware of her presence in the corner of my eye. I mucked out old Ben's stall, checked the store of winter feed, and repaired a broken hinge on the door. I worked with the slow, methodical pace of a man who knows that routine is the only wall against chaos. All the while she watched. Her silence was a heavy blanket in the barn. At midday, I brought her a bowl of hot bean soup and another piece of bread from the house. I set it down without a word and went back to my work. She ate slowly, carefully. When she was finished, she did something that surprised me. She got to her feet, unsteady, but determined, and took the empty bowl to the water trough. She washed it out, scrubbing it with her bare hands in the icy water until it was clean, then set it carefully on the crate beside her straw bed. I stopped what I was doing and watched. In that small, simple act, she was speaking volumes. She was not a charity case. She would not simply take. She was showing me she had dignity, that she understood the principle of exchange, even if all she had to offer was the labor of her own 2 hands. Something shifted between us in that moment. Later that afternoon, as I was struggling to mend a thick leather strap on a harness, she approached. She moved with a silence that was startling. One moment I was alone, the next she was standing there. She pointed to the torn leather, then to the awl and wax thread hanging from a nail on the wall. I hesitated for only a second before handing them to her. Her fingers, though raw and chapped, were surprisingly nimble. She stitched the thick leather with a series of small, tight, even stitches that were far better than my own clumsy work. She worked with a focused intensity, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she was done, she handed the repaired harness strap back to me. I tested the seam, pulling on it with all my strength. It held firm. I looked at her and gave a single appreciative nod. For the first time, the corner of her mouth twitched the ghost of a smile that vanished as quickly as it appeared. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long blue shadows across the snow, the questions I had been suppressing began to surface. Who was she? Where were her people? Why was she alone? But I didn't ask. I knew what it was like to have your wounds prodded by the curious. Some things needed the healing balm of silence. That evening, as I lit the lantern in the barn filled with a warm, flickering glow, she spoke without being prompted. Her voice was still rough, her English broken, but the words were clear enough. Town, she said, her gaze fixed on the barn wall as if seeing the memory projected there. They say, I take bread. I listened, my body still, my hands resting on my knees. I could see it all. Her desperate and hungry. The self-righteous faces of the shopkeeper, the men eager for a reason to hate, to cast out someone who was different. It was a story as old as the mountains. My family, gone, she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. Fever. 2 winters passed. My chest tightened. Fever. Another connection, another shared scar on our souls. I had lost my family to fever. The town had offered empty words and then forgotten. Now here was another soul set adrift by the same cruel fate, and the town's response was to chase her into a blizzard. You won't be harmed here, Alara, I said, and the conviction in my own voice surprised me. It was a promise spoken aloud to her and to myself. I won't let them. She looked at me then. Truly looked at me. The fear in her eyes was still there, but it was mingled with something else now. A flicker of hope, perhaps. Or maybe just the sheer exhaustion of a fight she could no longer wage alone. She pulled my coat tighter around herself and lay back down in the straw. I laid out my feed sacks by the door, the cold floor a familiar penance. As the barn settled into silence just before sleep, claimed her, she whispered one more thing into the darkness, the words barely audible. Thank you. I heard it. I lay awake for a long time after that, staring up at the dark, heavy beams of the roof. I didn't know what the coming days would bring. I didn't know if I had invited trouble or salvation into my life. But as I listened to the steady, soft sound of her breathing, I knew one thing for certain. Deep down, past the fear and the uncertainty, the crushing silence of my life had finally been broken. The days that followed fell into a strange and quiet rhythm. The snowstorm had passed, leaving behind a world of pristine, almost blinding white, the sky a brilliant, painful blue. The cold, however, remained a deep and penetrating chill that settled in the bones. Each morning I would rise from my makeshift bed on the floor, and she would already be awake watching me. We rarely spoke, but a silent language began to form between us, a language of shared tasks and mutual respect. She never asked for anything. Not for warmer clothes, not for better food, not for a place in the house. But she began to make herself a part of the farm's existence. When I chopped wood, she would gather the split logs and stack them in neat, tight rows against the barn wall. When I hauled buckets of water from the well, she would scrub the trough until it was free of ice and grime. She moved with a purpose and efficiency that spoke of a life of hard work. The farm, which had long felt like my solitary burden, began to feel like a shared responsibility. I knew with a certainty that gnawed at me that this fragile peace couldn't last. We were isolated by the snow, but the snow would eventually melt. I was running low on flour and salt, and old Ben needed a new shoe. A trip to Solitude was unavoidable. The thought of it filled me with a cold dread. Taking her with me would be like parading a doe before a pack of wolves. The whispers, the stares, the open hostility, I could already feel them. But leaving her alone at the farm felt even worse. What if someone came by? What if those men from town, emboldened by their righteousness, decided to come looking for her? She would be defenseless. I wrestled with the decision for 2 days. On the third morning, after a breakfast of plain porridge eaten in our usual silence, I made my choice. I have to go to town, Alara, I said, setting my bowl down. For supplies. It's better if you come with me. Her head snapped up, and for the first time in days, I saw that raw fear back in her eyes. She shook her head, a single sharp movement. She pulled the coat. My coat, which she now wore constantly tighter around her, a meager fortress. Is not good, she said, her voice low. They hate me. I know, I said, my voice gentle but firm. But you'll be with me. No one will touch you. I won't let them. If they try, they'll answer to me. It was a bold promise, and a part of me wondered if I could keep it. But I knew I had to try. I waited. I didn't push or plead. I simply let my words hang in the cold air between us. She looked at my face, her dark eyes searching for something, a weakness, a lie. After a long, tense minute, she gave a slow, reluctant nod. She rose from the crate she used as a chair. The state of her dress was a constant nagging shame to me. Before we left, I went into the house and opened the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed. The scent of dried lavender and 10 years of solitude rose to meet me. From the very bottom, I pulled out one of Hannah's old winter shawls. It was made of thick, dark wool, plain but warm. I brought it out to the barn and held it out to her. She looked at the shawl, then at me, her expression unreadable. She hesitated, then took it from my hands. She draped it over her shoulders, the thick wool covering the rips in her dress. For a moment she closed her eyes and pressed her cheek against the fabric as if she could feel the warmth and kindness of the woman who had worn it before. The sight of it, this ghost of my wife's compassion embracing this stranger, caused a painful tightening in my chest. I pushed the feeling down and turned away to hitch old Ben to the wagon. The journey to Solitude was long and cold. The road was barely passable, the snow packed hard and uneven. Alara sat beside me on the wagon seat, rigid and silent, her hands clenched in her lap. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon as if she expected trouble to ride out of the white landscape at any moment. As we neared the town, the silence between us stretched thin. The folks in this town, I said, not looking at her, they live by a hard set of rules. Most of them are just scared of anything they don't understand. She didn't reply, but I felt her shift beside me, a small acknowledgement. The main street of Solitude was a rutted track of mud and melting snow lined with gray-weathered buildings. As our wagon rattled into town, heads turned. Conversations on the boardwalk ceased. Eyes cold and curious followed our progress. I felt Alara shrink beside me, trying to make herself smaller. I kept my gaze fixed straight ahead, my jaw set. I pulled up in front of Gable's Mercantile. Agnes Gable, the proprietor, was a widow in her 60s with a tongue as sharp as a skinning knife. But as I'd learned over the years, a sense of fairness that was often buried deep. "Stay close," I murmured to Alara as I helped her down from the wagon. The moment we stepped inside the warm, cluttered store fell silent. Agnes Gable stood behind the counter, her spectacles perched on the end of her nose. She took one long look at Alara huddled in Hannah's shawl. Then her sharp eyes met mine. "Abel," she said, her voice devoid of its usual sarcastic bite. "Didn't expect to see you before the spring thaw." "Ran out of flour, Agnes," I said, setting my list on the counter. "And nails. And a shoe for my mule." I paused, then added, my voice low and clear, "And a pair of sturdy woman's boots. And some warm cloth. Blue if you have it." I didn't look at Alara, but I felt her go utterly still beside me. Agnes's gaze flickered to Alara's feet, then back to my face. A dozen unspoken questions passed between us. She saw the girl's exhaustion, the fear she was trying so hard to hide, and the fierce protective set of my own shoulders. Without another word, she disappeared into the back of the store. She returned with the supplies and a pair of well-oiled leather boots that looked warm and durable. She laid a bolt of heavy blue wool on the counter along with a packet of needles and thread. I counted out the coins, placing them on the worn wood. Agnes pushed a few of them back toward me. "The cloth is a remnant," she said gruffly, not quite meeting my eye. "No charge. And see that she wears those boots. The ground's no place for bare feet in winter." Alara, who had been silent the entire time, looked up at the older woman. "Thank you," she whispered the words so soft I almost didn't hear them. Agnes gave a short, sharp nod in reply. Our trial, however, was not over. As we stepped back onto the boardwalk, a man who had been leaning against a post deliberately spat a wad of tobacco juice into the snow near her feet. It was Caleb, a mean-spirited layabout who always had a sneer ready. "Well now, Abel," he drawled, his voice loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. "Didn't figure you for the type to be bringing home strays. Especially not that kind." I stopped. The cold air seemed to crystallize around us. I could feel Alara trembling beside me. I turned my head slowly and met Caleb's watery, mocking eyes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "She's with me, Caleb," I said, my voice flat and cold as a river stone. "And this is my business, not yours." "Is it now?" he smirked. "Town's got a right to be concerned about who's living up on that hill. We run her out for a reason." I took a step toward him, and he instinctively took a step back. "The only thing you need to be concerned about, Caleb," I said, my voice dropping even lower, "is getting out of my way. Now." There was no heat in my voice, only a deadly chill. It was the voice of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. He saw it in my eyes. He held my gaze for another second, his smirk faltering, Then he looked away, muttering a curse under his breath. The boardwalk was silent. People who had been watching suddenly found something fascinating to look at in the shop windows. I helped Alara back onto the wagon, and we rode out of town, the eyes of solitude following us, until we were out of sight. The ride home was as quiet as the ride in, but the silence was different. It was less tense, filled with a new fragile understanding. Alara sat with her back straight, wearing her new boots, her hands resting on the bolt of blue cloth in her lap. When we were halfway home, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "You were not afraid." I thought about it for a moment, my eyes on old Ben's steady gait. "I've lived through worse than Caleb's opinion," I said. "Being afraid didn't change anything then. It won't now. I stand by my choices." She looked at me, a long, searching look. Then for the first time, a genuine smile touched her lips. It was a small, hesitant thing, but it was like seeing the first flower of spring push its way through a field of snow. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows of fear and hardship. That night, she sat by the lantern's glow in the barn, the new blue cloth spread across her lap. She was already planning, measuring with her eyes. When I laid out my pallet of feed sacks by the door, as I had every night, she spoke before I could lie down. "You are a safe man, Abel Mason." The words were spoken with a quiet, simple sincerity that struck me deeper than any praise I had ever received. I turned my head and met her eyes across the flickering light. I didn't say anything. I just nodded. But as I lay down on the cold, hard floor, something inside me had begun to thaw. For the first time in 10 long frozen years, the house on the hill didn't feel quite so empty. The thought of the coming days no longer filled me with a sense of weary dread, but with a flicker of something I barely recognized. It might have been hope. Life often tests us in moments of silence rather than noise. Abel Mason's choice to lift Alara out of the snow reminds us that compassion is rarely convenient, yet it always matters. We live in a world where it is easy to look away, to say "not my problem," especially when others have been cast aside. But the measure of a life well lived is not found in how tightly we guard our solitude. It is found in how bravely we break it for the sake of another. For older hearts who have carried grief, the lesson runs deep, even when our own days feel emptied by loss. There is healing in small acts of kindness. Offering bread, sharing warmth, standing firm against cruelty, these choices can thaw what years of sorrow have frozen, and remind us that it is never too late to make another soul feel safe. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.